When it comes to air power, America is unmatched. The world's largest and most potent air force by a wide margin is the Air Force of the United States. The runner-up? Well, that's the Navy of the United States. Ranking in the global top 10 by number of military aircraft are also the United States Army and the United States Marine Corps. America's newest fighter aircraft are hyper-advanced and functionally invisible to their adversaries. Its tried-and-true workhorse fighters are among the very best in the world. Its bomber fleet can do things no other bomber fleet on Earth can accomplish, and its ability to move cargo, to refuel entire air fleets in flight, and to maintain awareness of an entire battlescape are all without compare on the global stage. But American air power isn't just formidable. American air power is changing. The reasons are complex, ranging from new acquisitions of unbelievably sophisticated technology to real-world constraints like budgeting and strategy to the new demands of the shifting modern battlefield. It's an approach that promises to rewrite the way America fights its air wars, redefine the meaning of American air supremacy, and pioneer a strategic approach not just to 2020's air wars, but to air wars across the entire 21st century. This video is brought to you by War Thunder, the ultimate playground for military history buffs and vehicle combat enthusiasts alike. Have you ever wanted to command a tank, fly a jet, helm a battleship, maybe all three? Well, War Thunder lets you do just that. In the game, of course, not in real life. That would be weird. You get to take control of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from the 1920s to the modern day. One of the most impressive things is the damage X-ray view. When your vehicle, or hopefully your enemies, gets destroyed, you can see exactly how it happened. The X-ray view shows you where the shell penetrated, what components were hit, and ultimately what led to your vehicle's demise. Whether you're a casual player looking for some arcade fun or a hardcore simulator fan, War Thunder has a game mode for you. And best of all, you can play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. Just make sure to use the link in the video description or the pinned comment to sign up. If you make a new account or haven't played in 6 months, you'll also receive a massive bonus pack with loads of goodies to give you a good head start in the game. Besides 3 premium vehicles, you'll also receive a 50% experience and income booster, 2 advanced vehicles for rent, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account time, among other things. Thank you to them for sponsoring, and now back to today's video. On February the 12th, 2024, the United States Air Force announced that change was on the horizon. Together with the US Space Force, the USAF's top brass announced a raft of changes meant to reorient the service toward an age of greater power competition. Among the strategic shifts were a few rather pedestrian ones, but several that were a good deal more substantial. America's nuclear forces got a good deal of support. The organization committed to expanding the ranks of technical personnel to use modern warfighting methods, and it called for large-scale exercises of a kind America has largely held off from performing, with hopes that they may get the US ready for large-scale wartime operations against militarily powerful adversaries. Said the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, about the changes, quoting here, "We need these changes now. We are out of time to reoptimize our forces to meet the strategic challenges in a time of great power competition." And reiterating again later on, quoting again, "We are out of time." Now, perhaps the most important part of the Air Force's new plan is its emphasis on versatility. The strategic shift calls for the creation of a new command center called the Integrated Capabilities Command, meant to do basically what it says on the tin, to bring together planning operations at a large scale and figure out how to use the Air Force's many capabilities together with increasing effectiveness. Other provisions in the report suggest much of the same in different areas of Air Force operations. And while that's a new thing for the USAF to publicize that it's thinking about, it's a shift that the service has increasingly woken up to, not as a good idea, but as a necessity. Underscoring that fact was the clear urgency the Air Force wanted to convey as part of its announcement. Quoting Secretary Frank Kendall once again, "We are out of time." That's a reality that has increasingly come home to roost in the minds of Air Force leaders. Well accustomed to having the best air arm on planet Earth, the US has been ineffective, and some might even say complacent, in keeping its advantage for the long term. China, for example, now boasts hundreds of Chengdu J-20 stealth fighter aircraft, seemingly ideal to ambush America's key airborne control, tanker, and strategic lift aircraft. The J-20 and a range of other fighter aircraft fly alongside hundreds of strategic bombers and dozens of electronic warfare and control planes. Russia, although its purportedly fifth-generation Su-57 fighter jet is nowhere to be found over the skies of Ukraine, still brings a potent arsenal of well over 1,000 other air superiority and multi-role fighters, and has the potential to draw the US into a very damaging air war over continental Europe. Neither Russia nor China are projected to actually catch up to America anytime soon, at least in terms of air power, but that's not the point. The US Air Force's current approach is one built for an American public that's unwilling to accept major combat losses, and for a military branch that's long grown used to establishing air superiority quickly and operating in uncontested skies thereafter. Meanwhile, both America's primary adversaries, Russia especially, are learning the hard lessons of 21st century air warfare and enhancing their capabilities accordingly. Get into a conflict against them, and the US is almost certain to come out on top, but it's almost guaranteed to absorb costs and deal with complications that it simply isn't prepared to accept. And while the United States typically deals with these sorts of problems by building new aircraft, that's an approach with problems that are increasingly on display. Perhaps the most troublesome right now is the Next Generation Air Dominance Program, or NGAD, meant to produce the world's first sixth-generation fighter. Now, on paper, the plans for the NGAD are highly impressive. Exceptionally sophisticated onboard technology, so-called adaptive cycle engines that can operate across many speeds, and the ability to fly very stealthily while commanding a group of drone wingmen and calling the shots for other American warplanes in a battle environment. But today, year-over-year budgets for the NGAD are shrinking, and some leaders within the US Air Force have even implied that difficult options like slashing the program entirely may be on the table. More likely is a redesign of some kind, intended to bring down costs and potentially a reduction in the overall number of fighters that the US intends to procure. But just how far that number could drop, that's unknown, and per statements by Air Force Secretary Kendall, the redesigns might not only eliminate adaptive cycle engines, but potentially drop the entire piloted NGAD concept in favor of an unmanned redesign. Now, these sorts of cost-saving measures, they're nothing new in the United States. In fact, the entire NGAD program is so urgent, largely because America slashed its F-22 Raptor program decades ago, attempting to save money during the War on Terror. But a slimmed-down or even slashed NGAD program would compound those problems and put American air superiority in the hands of two underdeveloped programs in a row. That in turn would force a greater reliance on the multi-role F-35 and force America to start sacrificing real capabilities in a war environment. Other research and development programs are doing somewhat better. For example, America's next-generation bomber aircraft, the B-21 Raider, has pulled off the rare feat of being both on time and under budget. But unfortunately, the Raider fleet is projected to include as few as 100 aircraft, a figure generally believed to be well below the number the US would need in order to phase out its aging bomber fleet. That's because the Raider will have to compete for budget, not against other bomber designs, but against new US logistical programs like the Liberty Lifter seaplane program, its Pegasus air refueling tanker, its next-generation strategic airlift aircraft, and secretive potential programs like the purportedly Mach-10 capable Project Mayhem and the alleged spy drone, the RQ-180. All the while, the US has to maintain the aging aircraft it already has in service, produce new and better munitions, and think about the next generation of advanced projects to ensure that the USAF's upcoming evolution isn't its last. Every one of the Air Force's initiatives are, by nature, meant to up the ante for global air strategy. Quoting General Mike Minahan, who leads the Air Force's Air Mobility Command in regards to its upcoming projects, quote, "We must imagine and demand a flight line where field and platform are unrecognizable to our grandparents." It's high ambition, to be sure, but the drive to develop and pay for so many unrecognizable things at once brings an incredible amount of pressure. And as America's military budget cracks under the intense demand of the Air Force, the country's military leaders have also begun to realize that it's time to question just what American air power is meant to accomplish. For decades, the Air Force has been part of America's war on terror across the Middle East and Central Asia, and partly because of the Air Force itself, partly because of Washington, the country's air fleet has shifted to match. Today, US air power is optimized for counterinsurgencies, for long patrols in safe airspace, and for the fundamental assumption that America's adversaries cannot compete with it in the skies. Until recently, it's been the prevailing wisdom in US air strategy that America's future air superiority could be handled by a couple of hundred stealthy fighter jets, that those same stealthy fighter jets were the best weapon to handle air-to-ground operations, and that no new adversary would be ready to challenge the US anytime soon. Today, though, the US faces major power competitors on multiple fronts, and in a world where American air power could, say, have to defend Europe against Russia, defend Taiwan against China, and defend Israel against Iran and its proxies all at once, the balance of power is shifting. Sure, America has allies to rely on, and sure, it has really, really good aircraft, but splitting those aircraft across multiple hot zones while dealing with multiple kinds of threat is something the US is supposed to be good at, and it simply isn't. Focused on decades of asymmetrical warfare against insurgents, whilst having its budget consumed by the vampiric influence of costly projects like the F-35, the B-2 bomber, and the F-22, the Air Force has been caught lacking in a major way. Sure, the Air Force is more than a match for China, but divided into thirds, well, even under perfect conditions, can 60-odd F-22s, under 100 F-35s, and a couple of hundred F-16, a handful of stealth bombers, and a severely reduced number of tankers, reconnaissance planes, and other assets really provide the dominant win over China that the American people expect? It's not really likely, is it? And hamstringing America's ability to make up the gap now as much as in the last few decades is the country's seeming obsession with stealth aircraft. Sure, stealth jets are very, very helpful for those nations that can leverage them, but they aren't everything. In order to operate stealthily at all, they've got to use internal weapon space, seriously limiting both the number and size of munitions that they carry. They're also very expensive, difficult to maintain and repair, and global air defense systems are starting to catch up to them, at least in some ways. Stealth is important. It's a weapon that, when used right, can decide the course of battles or perhaps even wars. But it isn't everything. Today, the Air Force appears to recognize that it's dealing with headwinds from multiple sources at once. It lacks critical funding, it's got too many problems piling up at once, and it's spent decades making decisions under a series of assumptions about the world's future, only to see those assumptions breaking apart at the seams. Frankly, it's too big a set of obstacles to be solved by brute force. There is not a version of the United States in which, say, Social Security or Medicare is gutted in order to beef up the strength of the USAF. But in a situation where the Air Force has been forced to think critically about the assets it has rather than relying on the magic appearance of new ones, the organization has begun to string together some real solutions. And at least in theory, those solutions are actually looking pretty darn good. The Air Force can't just wave its hand and replace the aircraft inventory it has. It can't bully other parts of the US government into fully funding an NGAD program or committing to all the initiatives it wants. And it can't get back money that it's already spent on research, development, procurement, maintenance, or training. Instead, the Air Force's solutions will have to be tactical and strategic, using all the benefits and all the drawbacks of its current situation in order to become the fighting force that its country now needs. To illustrate the Air Force's answer, we'll begin with one particular piece of new technology, the F-15EX Eagle II. Now, we've published an entire episode recently on the F-15EX over on our Mega Projects channel, so do check that out if you're interested. But to summarize, the Eagle II is a sort of rebirth project for America's esteemed, albeit aging, F-15 Eagle. Capable of flying above Mach 2.5, around 2,800 miles per hour, the Eagle II can carry about 30,000 pounds of munitions, including up to more than 20 missiles or bombs, boasting a wide combat radius, and a whole lot more. The unstealthy Eagle II isn't the only surprise aircraft that you might not expect the US Air Force to be procuring. Look no further than the OA-1K Skywarden, a prop plane that the US is working hard to procure in the year 2024. But unlike the Skywarden, the F-15EX is intended to fly alongside hypermodern 5th-gen fighters and even the NGAD, and it'll be a major part of the Air Force's arsenal for many decades to come. In fact, the US Congress is pushing the Air Force to acquire more and more of them, with a real possibility that the current projections for the Eagle II fleet, a bit over 100, may only be the start. The Eagle II is envisioned as what the USAF refers to as a missile truck, an aircraft that can carry a whole lot of ordnance of varying kinds depending on the mission, and ruin the day of whomever might happen to be in its path. That's an approach that, at least on paper, should work pretty well for the sort of war America just got done fighting, the kind of war that involves devastating the hideouts of terror organizations that lack the means to shoot down an aircraft. But although the Eagle II drew much of its design inspiration from those older wars, it's being procured at a time when that thinking has already changed. It's an unstealthy, bellowing bull of an aircraft at a time when America is thinking about how to go up against sophisticated rival militaries. And yet, the nation's military minds are looking for more of them, not less. But pair the Eagle II with the other weapons in America's arsenal, and its usefulness begins to make a whole lot more sense. An F-35, for example, carrying no more than 4 missiles or bombs internally, isn't going to be able to devastate many targets in a single run. But it can clear the way. Flying on scene through contested airspace, the F-35 can slip like a knife through enemy air defenses and launch precision attacks on the assets an enemy has standing on guard. That might be advanced fighter aircraft, it might be air defense systems on the ground, it might be radar installations or command and control aircraft. But regardless of what an adversary might have waiting, stealth aircraft are most likely to be able to clear the way. All the while, they'll be marking other targets and transmitting precise data back to the other aircraft engaged in their operation, providing a level of real-time intel that's all but unmatched in today's world. Once that happens, aircraft like the Eagle II become a whole lot more useful. Using medium to long-range munitions, they can hang out in areas where those now destroyed frontline defenses can no longer touch them, but where other air defense assets are too far to reach them. And it's not just the Eagle II either. This sort of approach should work, at least in theory, with strategic bombers, including the B-21 Raider, and it should work with America's other non-stealthy multi-role aircraft like the F-16 and the Navy's F/A-18. And high over the battlefield, we come to other new assets that are most critical to this new approach. Sixth-generation fighter aircraft like the NGAD and potentially other aircraft that use sixth-generation technologies like the B-21 Raider are special for a whole lot of reasons. But perhaps greatest among them is those aircraft's ability to serve as a hub to process incredible amounts of data and real-time battlefield intelligence. To explain just how this works, we'll borrow an analogy from defense expert Alex Hollins via Sandbox. The F-22 Raptor, America's most sophisticated air superiority jet at present, has an avionics suite that allows it to help other aircraft identify and destroy targets, keeping command and control over a battlefield in a way that allows it to function as a sort of aerial quarterback during a battle. Now, for our viewers not familiar with American football, a quarterback is tasked with commanding and coordinating their team in real time, deciding where to exploit weaknesses in order to score. But if the Raptor is a quarterback, then the NGAD is expected to be more of an offensive coordinator, a person sitting on the sidelines, or in this case, out in the direct heat of battle, in order to do a whole lot of advanced tactical thinking very quickly. Their job is to impact the entire game, or in this case, the entire battle space. With hyper-advanced sixth-generation aircraft in the skies, coordinating and maneuvering a combined swarm of piloted aircraft and drones in real time, the US gains a level of situational awareness that's unheard of in aerial warfare. And while historically adding a whole lot of different sorts of aircraft acting in different mission roles to accomplish a common task tends to make the whole mission harder, that's not the case when a data hub like the NGAD is involved. The aircraft's sensor technology is purportedly able to detect and target enemy aircraft from extreme ranges, and it's meant to be able to transfer that data to other pilots and drones near instantaneously. The NGAD's value, at least as it's currently being drawn up, isn't as a dogfighter or even as a long-range air superiority fighter in the way that we typically think of them. It's meant to be a master tactician, not a piece of hardware that takes part in a fight, but a strange sort of consciousness, taking the other American aircraft in the sky and transforming them into a single unified organism. With that sort of battlefield overwatch, the US Air Force would be able to leverage the potential of its various aircraft simultaneously, while allowing each of those aircraft to focus on what they're best at. Instead of expecting F-35 squadrons to use their limited ordnance to take out an entire region's military assets, they can focus on using their stealth where it matters most, picking off enemy aircraft before they're discovered, scoping out targets just minutes before the cavalry arrives, and surgically dismantling the systems that would stand against an air assault. Fourth-generation aircraft, instead of being held back by their lack of stealth technology, can be used more effectively in combat zones where stealth is no longer needed, while relying on the awareness of a higher authority that can guide their actions. Tankers, airlifters, early warning and control planes, and more can all run more precise missions or fly along more precise, safe routes, confident that they're being watched over, even in an austere environment. And depending on the new mission role, this new approach grants the US the versatility to match. If America is launching on fortified enemy territory, it can leverage its stealth aircraft, then its missile trucks, then its heavy bombers in waves that would be near unstoppable for most modern militaries. If America needs to defend, say, Poland and the Baltics against a Russian advance, it can better coordinate its defense and counterattacks over a wide area, using its stealth aircraft when necessary and its non-stealthy aircraft when possible to fight individual air battles overseen by NGAD data hubs, all coordinating with each other in real time for continental defense. If the US needs to protect its homeland or guard over secure airspace, it can do that without having to rely on its costly stealth fighters, but still gain the stealth capability and the battlespace awareness that a few sophisticated command and control planes give it. But just as critical is the possibility that this new approach wouldn't cost more, it would actually cost less. In the case of the NGAD, using the aircraft in concert with a range of other aircraft and loyal wingman drones means that putting, say, 4 or 8 or 12 NGADs into a single battle is overkill. Sure, you could do it, but the combination of America's existing range of fighter assets, plus the situational awareness that a single, nearly invisible NGAD can provide, will be enough to overcome US adversaries for quite a while. Not only does that lower the number of NGAD aircraft needed, but it buys the US valuable time to address other critical priorities. Meanwhile, an air force that doesn't rely on stealthy F-35s for tasks where stealth isn't really necessary is able to save on operating costs at a bare minimum and could, conceivably, downsize the overall F-35 fleet, currently projected to include nearly 1,400 aircraft. Adopt an approach that should be better at keeping America's new B-21s protected in contested airspace, and it's more feasible to consider just purchasing 100 for now because they've got a higher chance of surviving if some crisis really does devolve into a costly war. Keep on poking into the budgetary benefits of the Air Force's purported shift in strategy, and it keeps on getting chunks of its money back in ways that should allow the Pentagon to recover from its desperation mode and space out more affordable initiatives over the next decade or two, instead of trying, and probably continuing to fail, in the Herculean task of getting everything done now. Alright, so that's the what and the why of the Air Force's emerging strategic shifts, or at least that's how we in the unclassified world can best read the tea leaves. But it's also important to focus on the how, because introducing individual new aircraft like the NGAD or the Raider doesn't tell the whole story. The individual technologies that power the Air Force's new shift are even more important. While there are some, like those aircraft's new advancements in stealth technology that we couldn't even hope to learn about in the public domain, the ones we do know about are very impressive and seem to suggest that if this is what the public knows about, then there's some seriously unbelievable stuff getting worked on behind the scenes. Now we'll start with a Mako, a missile that takes just about every fighter-carried munition in history and puts it to shame. Mako is a so-called standoff missile developed by Lockheed Martin, intended to be able to strike naval and ground targets from very far away after being launched from the air. It also happens to be hypersonic, meaning that it can fly at over 5 times the speed of sound. But not only is it incredibly fast, it's highly maneuverable too. The combination of high speed and maneuverability is thought to make it entirely able to penetrate advanced air systems where interceptors are too slow to catch it and not maneuverable enough to chase it. The Mako's exact top speed is unknown, but it's able to operate at above or below hypersonic speeds. And that's not all. The Mako is the first hypersonic weapon ever from any country to be able to fit inside the weapons bay of a 5th-generation fighter aircraft. That includes not just the F-35, but the F-22, each of which could carry Mako missiles internally while maintaining their stealthy attributes. The Mako can also fly on the F-15, the F-16, the Navy's FA-18, almost certainly the Eagle II, and even the Navy's P-8 Poseidon, derived from the Boeing 737. It's the Mako that enables stealth fighters to so precisely, so reliably devastate enemy air defenses. After all, they can be carried right up to the location of their target, and by the time they begin their own hypersonic flight, it's already too late to stop them. That is a level of capability that Russia and China just can't match. Both nations are able to launch hypersonic weapons, but neither can do it from an aircraft, let alone a stealth aircraft. Also in weapons news is the AIM-260, the Joint Advanced Tactical Missile. It's a beyond visual range air-to-air missile meant to take over for America's current beyond visual range missile, the AIM-120 AMRAAM. And when it does, it'll offer a major increase in capabilities over its predecessor. Specifically, the AMRAAM offers a range of about 95 nautical miles in its most advanced iteration, while the AIM-260 is expected to fire at a minimum range of about 110 nautical miles. That's not only out of range, but also out of radar sight for most aircraft that would be trying to hit back at the plane that launched it. And while the AMRAAM flies at Mach 4, the new missile flies at Mach 5. It features much better onboard technology than the AMRAAM, even the new versions, and it's able to fly again with both the F-22 and the F-35, but it's also able to fly with the Eagle II. To give an idea of just what this missile is capable of, let's imagine, say, a dozen Russian Su-27 planes flying in formation against 3 American warplanes, one F-22, one NGAD, and one Eagle II. The F-22, as we've explained, can fly ahead undetected, marking every single aircraft of the Russian squadron without being detected. The F-22 beams that data back to the NGAD, and the NGAD presents a fully mapped, fully targeting-ready profile of the battlefield to the Eagle II, which happens to be flying over 100 miles away, well out of the range of the Russian aircraft, carrying more than 20 air-to-air missiles that can attack at hypersonic speeds from that extreme distance, which they can cross at Mach 5 in about a minute and a half. With the F-22 and the NGAD there to pick off anyone who survives, hanging out unseen at a closer range, that Su-27 formation gets dealt with in about 2 minutes. The AIM-260 is expected to enter service by the end of this year. And just as important as weaponry are the pieces of technology that will make older fighters, bombers, support aircraft, and command and control planes compatible with the data processing systems that the NGAD, the Raider, and the F-35 will have on board. One such item is the Sniper Advanced Targeting Pod, currently in use on America's Stratofortress and Lancer bombers, as well as the F-15E and F-16 fighter aircraft and the A-10 attack aircraft. It's been in service for more than 2 decades, but it's gotten major upgrades as of late, including new improvements that vastly expand its ability to participate in data sharing networks. Today, the Sniper Pod can communicate not just with stealth aircraft, but other aircraft involved in an operation, and even ground-based assets like the HIMARS missile launcher, using encrypted systems that are compatible with what these less sophisticated aircrafts already have on board. It's this capability that makes munitions like the AIM-260 so meaningful, all but guaranteeing that aircraft equipped for combat at standoff range will be receiving the information that allows them to use that capability. Just as important as individual bits of technology are the changes the US Air Force is making to the way it thinks about its aircraft. Take, for example, the idea of a missile truck, something that's made possible by special pylon extenders that allow an aircraft to carry 2, 3, or 4 missiles or bombs on a hardpoint that would usually just carry 1. That's an idea already in use for the F-15EX Eagle II, but it can go a lot further. Take, for example, the unexpected hardpoint expansions of the US Navy's P-8 aircraft, which may well receive more and more pylons over time too. In fact, there's a good bit of theoretical weirdness that we can get into here. Take, for example, a pylon extender that could fit 4 missiles meant for an Eagle II aircraft, and then imagine how many you could mount on the wings of, say, an extensively modified C-5 Galaxy. 100? 200? Now, obviously, making single C-5s into the sort of missile trucks that could take down rival air forces from standoff range is not currently on the cards, but it is an example to illustrate just what the USAF could do if it continues thinking outside the box with that new tool. And the versatile thinking goes way further than that. Defense analysts have proposed that the B-21 Raider could conceivably serve in the role of the NGAD if the NGAD were hypothetically cut entirely or seriously scaled down, and so long as we don't expect the B-21 to take on a dogfighting role, the analysts have a point. The design for the Raider may also soon be adapted into America's upcoming stealthy aerial refueling tanker, currently designated the NGAS or the KC-Z. Its Liberty Lifter proposal calls for seaplane airlifters that can do double duty as mobile command posts on the water, while its F-35s are increasingly being adapted to serve a wide range of mission roles, including enabling them to better take over the role that the A-10 attack aircraft will eventually leave behind. And all these aircraft will merge together with a fleet of unmanned drones, including not just the upcoming Loyal Wingman line of UAVs, but potentially aircraft that can build on the technology the Air Force demonstrated in September 2023, when an AI-powered, autonomous, heavily modified F-16 proved capable of dogfighting with a human pilot and ultimately went 5 for 5 in victories over the humans behind the stick. And finally, Air Force officials have indicated recently that at least with their NGAD program, they may be interested in moving back to an idea that was briefly discussed for the program and then thrown out: the Digital Century series. The name is a play on America's Century series of aircraft from the 1950s and 60s, the F-100 through the F-106, which put small batches of each line of aircraft into production one after the other in order to cope with the rapid technological advancement at the time. For a while, the idea has been circulated in reference to the NGAD, indicating a program that would develop smaller batches of open-system, highly modular aircraft that were each meant to serve only for a decade or two, rather than trying to build an NGAD in 2020 that could still be useful in 2070. Per recent reporting on the NGAD, the idea is making a comeback with potential to field new 6th generation and eventually 7th generation fighter aircraft every 5 to 10 years. Not only would that keep the USAF versatile in its new capabilities and allow it to respond to new threats as they emerge, but it would save additional costs, both on the development side and in procuring fighters that now only have to last a few years before being phased out. Expand that sort of thinking to aircraft across the Air Force's new and developing arsenal, and the burden of development cost in the 2020s can be at least somewhat relieved, spreading those costs across several subsequent decades. With all these changes in tactical and strategic thinking, all these new technologies, and very soon all these new aircraft, we're left with the most important question of all. Will these changes actually work? After all, as much as military leaders may want to impress on their subordinates that failure is not an option, that's simply not accurate. Failure is very much an option, and if the Air Force has chosen to heave itself into new ways of thinking and new approaches to warfare only to have them all fail under the pressure, well, that's an outcome that America would like to avoid at all costs. As for whether this new approach will actually work, well, it certainly has its naysayers. A large portion of the American military aerospace world still believes in the maxim of stealth above all, and strongly opposes an approach to warfare that would entrust any responsibility to an aircraft that can't stay hidden. Other detractors emphasize that this approach involves too many moving pieces, or that it relies on programs like the NGAD that could still end up getting slashed before even the end of this year. Others point out the risk of adopting a strategy that history hasn't ever validated, especially when America's enemies seem more dangerous than they've ever been. And still others worry that the budgetary spine of the Pentagon itself may snap under the pressure, knowing that after so many ambitious military development programs have so consistently gone over budget, an initiative of this size will lead to a financial catastrophe of a similar proportion. But while all those criticisms are fair, and all of them will need to be dealt with as time goes on, we've got to emphasize the state of affairs for both the proponents of this grand new approach and the detractors. The alternative to such a change is not to return to a status quo that's working just fine. The status quo in today's Air Force is unsustainable, weighed down by too many urgent projects in too many directions with no other way to lower the pressure except to make piecemeal cuts here and there. Make a big change and sure, a lot of things could go wrong, but stay the current course and make no mistake, a lot of things will go wrong. And the benefits to the Air Force's apparent new line of thinking go well beyond just giving America a chance to avert catastrophe. An approach like the one laid out for the Air Force offers real potential to draw down costs, both by moderating a few existing or proposed programs instead of slashing them outright, and by spacing out the costs of development and production over the course of the next few decades, instead of creating a make-or-break moment here in the 2020s. From a tactical and strategic perspective, an Air Force that leans into its ability to be versatile is certainly not a bad thing, and the thinking behind this particular interpretation of versatility appears to be sound. The approach makes one key assumption that simply must hold true if it's going to work: that America's stealth aircraft, its missile trucks, and its long-range munitions, its next-generation warplanes, and its information technology are all going to remain potent threats for the near-to-mid future. But so long as that holds true, the approach should work really rather well. And as for whether the US Air Force's capabilities will be matched by its next closest competitors, that doesn't seem likely in a world where the US continues improving instead of just stopping in its tracks. China's stealth fighters appear to be hamstrung by their difficulties working out the stealth materials needed to absorb radar, and their purportedly upcoming stealth bomber, the H-20, still nowhere to be found. Much of China's Air Force is outdated. It hasn't been tested in real-world conflict, and any potential future conflict, it's got to worry about not just the American Air Force, but the Japanese and South Korean Air Forces too. Russia has seen a number of new toys exposed as shadows of the wonder weapons they were hyped up to be, like the poorly performing Kinzhal hypersonic-ish missile and the S-400 missile defense system. Others have proven either too precious or too busted to risk sending out to the front lines, like the Su-57 fifth-ish generation fighter jet. Even more appear to be little more than vaporware, like the Su-75 Checkmate and PaK-DP fighters, or Tupolev's PaK-DA stealth bomber. Meanwhile, most of Iran and North Korea's air arsenals consist of warplanes that an F-22 could backhand into a different century without any need for help from an NGAD, a missile truck, or anything else. Iran's purported stealth fighter drone, the Qaher 313, hasn't appeared in public since a mock-up was lampooned by the foreign press back in 2013. From a strategic standpoint, the US military have even less to worry about when it comes to the sorts of rapidly evolving adversary capabilities that would catch up to and then pass the ongoing progress of the USAF. Since Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine kicked off in 2022, America and its allies have increasingly heeded the wake-up call that major power conflict is still a real possibility. In the intervening years, despite stop-and-start progress, the nations of NATO and America's Pacific allies have worked hard to make war less likely, not more. In Europe, NATO member nations are quickly bumping up their spending and looking for ways to reinvigorate a sleepy arms industry, with hopes that by the time Russia is ready to test NATO's resolve in Europe, the US will find itself backed up by a capable military force. In the Pacific, as we've explained at length on this channel recently, the US is increasingly weaving a web of military cooperation around China, drawing in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Australia, and more. While those war preparations are loud and at times rightly worrying for the future, they are designed to lower the possibility that war would actually break out. Neither Russia, nor China, nor anybody else are going to willfully start a war against someone they think is going to kick their asses. And the US and its global allies are hard at work trying to convince both Russia and China that a royal arse-kicking is now back on the table. The evolving capabilities of the US Air Force are part of that same deterrent effort, and in fact, they're one of the most important elements. In any major power war that does eventually break out, the USAF will be the tip of the spear. If it can show America's adversaries that it alone packs too much of a punch to be overcome, then war is deterred before all that other stuff is even taken into account. In the coming years, public announcements around America's Air Force are likely to be a mixed bag. Some programs will have their funding cut, a couple may even be slashed, and tough decisions will have to be made no matter how this goes. But if the US Air Force is indeed committed to the sorts of changes they appear to be seeking out, then that difficult news will be balanced out with a whole lot that would satisfy even America's toughest warhawks. From technology to tactics to training and more, the United States Air Force has realized that change is on the horizon, and flying toward the horizon at many times the speed of sound is precisely what an Air Force is meant to do. Just at the end here, big thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to play it for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox using my link below. New players get that big bonus pack we talked about, and thank you for watching.